Well, hello and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube for this week. And joining us from the Gulf Shores of Florida, Karen Abel. Karen, glad to have you on the show tonight.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
We are going to talk about an area of the country that is about as far away from Florida as you can possibly get, and that is we're going to Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, and we're going to talk about, theater of operations that's really not been talked very much about. We know about what happened up in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, but you have more information that you can share with us tonight.
Well, I hope so. I hope that everyone can walk away with a little bit more knowledge of the topic for sure.
Sounds good. Well, before we get formally into the presentation, as I said, Karen Abel is joining us, and we're going to talk about some of the aircraft that were stationed in the Aleutian Islands, some of the challenges they faced, and also a very personal connection that Karen has to this story. We'll get into all those details in just a moment. Now, whether you're joining us for the very first time or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're always happy to have you with us. If you enjoy what you see tonight, please don't forget to share it across your favorite social media platforms. We do appreciate that. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. If you'd like to know more about CAF, our events, how you can become involved, join a local wing or unit, or even better yet, take a ride in one of our aircraft. There are many of the CAF aircraft out on tour this summer. Just go to our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight, you listen to what Karen has to say, you see the presentation that she has, you might have some questions. We'll just type those in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. And with that, Karen, again, welcome to the show. Before we dive into the presentation, tell us a little bit about how you became fascinated with this aspect of the war.
My grandfather, after my grandfather passed, we discovered his flight logbook, as this is a very common story. We didn't know anything about his service. We knew that he served, we knew he was a pilot because he had his picture in the den and his uniform in the closet of the den. But it wasn't until after he died that I particularly became very interested in his service. And he was a Royal Canadian Air Forceman. I am from Canada. I've lived in the States for over 20 years. And I became fascinated with his story and realized that people, so then I thought it was a Canadian thing. People didn't realize that the Royal Canadian Air Force was in Alaska, attached to a U.S. fighter squadron. And I just, even in my early 20s, thought that people should know this. Like, this was an important and interesting part of history, and that people should know this. Well, fast forward 20 years, and now I'm living in the United States. And in 2012, I start talking about it with some neighbors and people in the community, and they don't know that there was a war in Alaska. And I thought, wow, Americans don't know there was a war in Alaska. A lot of them. I mean, that is the overwhelming sense that people who are born and raised here do not know there was a war right here on U.S. soil, on the continent. And I just thought that, okay, so this isn't just a national thing. This is like a continental issue. And I became incredibly determined to tell the story of those who served in Alaska, not just my grandfather's story, although that's personal to me. I want to tell the stories of all the service members so that they get some kind of recognition for what they did. There's 144,000 servicemen served in Alaska during World War II. That is a lot of servicemen who have gone under-recognized for their service. So that's how it started.
And I can tell from just in this brief conversation the passion that you have for this. And did you have an interest in history before you kind of discovered your grandfather's story, or was that really the catalyst that brought it home?
Well, I think I've always loved history. I can remember being in history class and thinking it's interesting. A little bit dry is what I would say. But no, I wouldn't say I was somebody who was heavy into history. But I mean, I am now. I love it. It's something that speaks to me so strongly, and I'm enthusiastic to be able to share what I know with other people. But I always say through me, but for them. So it's something that comes from outside of myself. It's not even me speaking. It's through me for them. So that somehow makes it more interesting or more, I don't know, impactful.
Well, and I agree, because we can learn dates and the history and the commanders and the top speed of this airplane, or how many rounds of ammunition it held, and all. Those are kind of the dry things that I think education sometimes feeds us. But what you've kind of discovered, and I think what a lot of us really, I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but treasure about World War II history, is being able to uncover the stories of the individuals who were part of it, who were just average run-of-the-mill people, right, who were called upon to do some pretty incredible things. And that's everywhere from the pilots to the ground crews to the guys who were cooking. I mean, there's a lot of things in it, and everyone had a story. And I guess that's kind of where we're going, is to kind of share some of those stories.
Yeah, everyone has a story, and they're all worthy of recognition. I will have Aleutian Island veterans who say, well, I was just an airframe mechanic. I'm like, yeah, well, without you, the airplanes couldn't fly. Your story is just as valuable as the pilots. Don't underestimate, your contribution to our freedoms. Like they're important, and they deserve to be told.
Absolutely.
And if you don't want to tell it for you, then why don't you tell the story of your squadron then, so that your squadron and all those maybe who were lost in the squadron can live through the story that you tell now, because you have the privilege of being alive. Yeah. So yeah, definitely passionate about it. And so I think that most people who think of World War II in Alaska, if they know about World War II in Alaska, they may know of the land battle and the land battle or land invasion, which was to remove Japanese forces off who were entrenched on American soil on the island of Attu, Operation Landcrab. That battle started May 11th, 1943, and it essentially ended tomorrow, more or less. There were small pockets still left, but the last banzai charge that the Japanese took on the island was May 29th. And that battle actually goes down as one of the costliest battles in the Pacific, because for every 100 of the enemy on the island, about 71 Americans were killed or wounded. So it is a significant battle, and it deserves its recognition. But what we don't realize is that for almost a year prior, U.S. and Canadian forces were working to remove the Japanese off of the islands of Kiska and Attu, trying to prevent a land invasion that became so costly for both parties. But I think before I wanted to just talk about World War II, I wanted just to talk about how the buildup of air defense in Alaska actually came about. It has a very long history, including Billy Mitchell, who flew his D-4H de Havillands up there in the 1920s. And he was followed 14 years later by Hap Arnold, who flew his B-10s up there on a scouting mission to the then territory. Both of them concluded that the defense of Alaska was very important and necessary, not only to defend against enemies, but also to defend against, or also to protect the resources that we had, and saw the airplane as a way to access those resources. And the higher ups in Washington, even though General Buckner, who became the Alaska Defense Commander, he was persistent on his cause of needing more forces in Alaska. The U.S. government at the time just didn't think that Alaska was a top priority in defense or in spending. So it wasn't until 1939 that any money got approved for military expenditures in Alaska or for the building of a base. That started with a cold weather test facility at Ladd Field, which wasn't exactly an air base, but it was a decent start. At the same time, they also approved the spending for the beginning of the construction of an airfield, a military airfield in Anchorage, which is now Elmendorf, still operational. Those bases opened up in 1940. September 1940 was Ladd, and I think it was November for Elmendorf. They became operational with the delivery of their very first aircraft. actually, that was interesting. The very first aircraft in Elmendorf to land, to declare it operational, was a Pelican, and that Pelican is actually at the Air Force Museum right now. So there's like these little bits of Alaskan history. I guess maybe because there wasn't an enormous amount of combat, but there's a lot of different Aleutian aircraft or Alaska-based aircraft that still are alive today because of enthusiasts like we all who love warbirds and want to see these things stay alive so that we can preserve their history and tell the stories. So that that Pelican that first landed on Elmendorf Field in November of 1941 still lives on. So if you're ever going to the Air Force Museum, go say hello. So it wasn't the very first squadrons of military aircraft didn't actually come until the spring, February, March, and it was P-36s and B-18s. They're very obsolete at that time. That's how they were going to defend Alaska, P-36s and B-18s. We'll give you some aircraft. We're going to give you those. The P-36s, they actually took apart, greased them up, and put them on a train and trained them up the air rail up to Alaska, and then they had to put them back together in their primitive base that Elmendorf was at the time. So it is quite a task and took a long time to do that. And they were the only defense of Alaska up until the spring of, I don't want to say the only defense, because there was a Grumman Goose, and there was a couple of civilian aircraft that the military had recruited to defend Southwest Alaska. You have to realize Alaska's huge, huge, huge territory. I think it's like, what is it, 2/3 the size of, or 2/3 bigger than Texas? Mm-hmm. It's huge. So those obsolete aircraft were the only ones defending Alaska until Pearl Harbor happens. And suddenly they realize, holy smokes, what's happening here? We need to get some air strength to Alaska right away. And that, I mean, that's easy to say, but it was slow to happen. So the first thing they did was mobilize a group of brand new pilots from Selfridge Field to take 24 P-40s from the Sacramento Air Depot up to Alaska. And that charge would be led by Jack Chenault. And Jack Chenault was Claire Chenault's oldest son. I don't know why they chose him, but he had been in the Air Force for years by then. But they chose him to, I don't know if it was, I'm not going to say punishment, but they chose him to lead. And it was the first transition flight of its kind for P-40s to fly that distance in January up to Alaska. I mean, it's quite a feat when you think about the distance, over 2,000 miles. And they weren't alone. They came up there with B-26s. So at the same time, both were deployed up to Alaska, formation of B-26, or a squadron of B-26s and a squadron of P-40s. They left January 1st, 1942. Half of the P-40s made it, and about half of the B-26s made it. Some were scattered along the way, some were recovered, and some were left where they lay, including 3 B-26s that were left somewhere in Canada. It's called the $1 Million Valley. Those B-26s were left there. Pilots were rescued, everybody lived, and some of those B-26s were recovered 50 years later. I can't remember the exact year. Over 50 years later, and Kermit Weeks owns one of them, and so does the Maps Museum in Ohio. They combined parts from those 3 aircraft, and they made 2 aircraft out of it. So there's 2 more Aleutian aircraft or Alaska aircraft that live on today. So once the P-40 squadron got up to Alaska, so we had the P-36s, that was the 18th squadron, and we had the 11th Fighter Squadron, that was the P-40s. Once the P-40s got up to Alaska, the 2 squadrons split in half. Half of the P-40 pilots went over to the 18th Squadron to fly, much to their dismay, P-36s. And half of the P-36 pilots, the 18th Fighter Squadron, went over to the P-40 section, to the 11th Fighter Squadron. And why they did that was so that the P-36 pilots could learn how to fly the P-40. And those P-36 pilots could then teach the P-40 pilots how to fly in Alaska, the nuances of what flying in Alaska is. And that saved a lot of pilots' lives. Because it's one thing to fly in an aircraft, and a lot of these P-40 pilots did not have a lot of hours when they were flying P-40s all the way up to Alaska. But it's one thing to fly anywhere, but it's a different thing to fly in Alaska. There's special things that you need to watch out for. And so by splitting up the squadrons, it allowed both to flourish. So air strength. So they got there about the end of January. There was no other people who came to help them. This was the air strength of Alaska, a territory that spans 1,400 miles. 1,400 is north to south. I mean, it's a massive territory, and this is what you have: some obsolete aircraft, one squadron of P-40s, and I'm not sure at that, just before the attack, how many were serviceable, and one squadron of B-26s. That is a lot for those little planes to handle. So it's clear that the air strength in Alaska was lacking. End of May, the Japanese cracked the code that stated that an attack on Alaska was imminent. This was going to happen. And now they scrambled to get squadrons up to Alaska, including P-39 squadron, a P-38 squadron, more B-17s, B-24 squadrons, A-29 squadrons, F-4Fs. PBYs were also in the area. Actually, I should say that. PBYs were already there. And it included the Royal Canadian Air Force. Enter my grandfather. My grandfather was stationed in Pat Bay. He was with 111 Fire Squadron. I will say that, so they cracked the Japanese code in May, end of May, 1942. Actually, it was like mid-May. My grandfather, the Royal Canadian Air Force and the United States Air Force, the two governments already had a defense agreement in the Permanent Joint Board of Defense. And the Royal Canadian Air Force was already on U.S. territory in Annette Island defending a U.S. naval base that was stationed on Canadian soil in Prince Rupert. So the two countries already had this defense partnership in place. The Permanent Joint Board of Defense was established in 1940. And the original agreement was that this was how it was going to happen. We were going to help defend the continent, but we didn't, Canada had questions about sending squadrons further north for fear that they would leave their own western borders underdefended. But with now cracking the Japanese code, they needed, America needed help. Those borders further north needed help. My grandfather's squadron was one of those fighter squadrons to be sent further north to defend the continent. They went up with a Bolingbroke squadron. I don't know. I'd be curious to know who knows what a Bolingbroke is. It's an old British bomber. It was probably obsolete too in 1942, but that's what they had. So they went all the way up north. They left June 3rd, and the Bolingbroke landed in Juneau, and it was having its first operational mission over the Gulf of Alaska, June 3rd, as Japan was bombing Dutch Harbor. So of that picture that just happened of the three P-40s, that one of those airplanes is still flying. And actually that's the one behind me there. That is Rudy, the former Rudy Frasca, now by the Frasca family, owned by the Frasca family, they own that P-40 in that picture. So that's another airplane that's still alive. So we're going to talk about Alaska's under attack. And they were able to do that pretty much unopposed, because the squadrons that were up in Alaska were actually and they were spread out over the territory. So we had a detachment in Cold Bay, and then we had a detachment in Elman and Umnak, which was a secret base called, I think it was called the Blair Packing Company. It was a secret base, and which actually worked because the Japanese didn't know we were there. The problem was there wasn't very good radio communication, so Japan, the Japanese Navy was able to move their ships within 250 miles of the island of Unalaska, where Dutch Harbor is, and launch an attack on the island unopposed and without radio communication to the closest base, which would have been in the secret base on Umnak. And so it doesn't mean, though, that being said, they launched an attack June 3rd and June 4th without us knowing it. On the way back, we subsequently, by accident, encountered these two Daves flying through. They were just going back to their carrier, and there were P-40s just on their regular patrols, encountered these two Daves out of nowhere, shot one down, the other one disappeared in the clouds. And at that point, you can just imagine how much higher alert there was. The next day, the same thing happened. Again, they were unopposed. The Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor unopposed. And we encountered the entire fleet of Kates and Zeros and Vals as they were coming back to their carrier, and their rendezvous point just happened to be just miles offshore of where the American base was, which was lucky for us because we were able to shoot down several of their airplanes. We also had one shot down too. And it was at that point that the Japanese realized, oh, wait, they have air defenses up here. Oh, we need to rethink our strategy a little bit. Also that with the Midway falling, they had to rethink their strategy just a little bit. And so in the subsequent days, they ended up landing on Kiska and Attu and started developing bases there. That also became, with that landing, that also became like the next several months of 1,000-mile missions. 1,000-mile missions over water with no emergency landing strips, no flat land in sight, horrific weather. And they did that through September when they finally built another runway further west on Adak, which was called Davis Army Airfield, named after the first, pretty much the founder of the 11th Air Force, which was Colonel Everett Davis, who died in a plane crash in September of 1942. So the Benjamin Talley, who was the engineer who led the Army Corps of Engineers and the base development of Alaska through the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, he and his team of people were able to build a runway using Marston matting. It's the first operational use of Marston matting in the war. They were able to build this runway within 10 days on Davis Army Airfield, or ADAC, which allowed the missions to be a little bit shorter. But then they were just 500 to 800-mile missions. That's all. Over water, still same conditions, but they were able to do that. And so it gave us a little more leeway. Still, that being said, that distance is really long. So enter the P-38. The P-38 squadron, it was the first operational squadron, again, of the war, was in Alaska, where the P-38 really was the ideal fighter plane for the territory because it had two engines, it had a long range, and they came to Alaska at the end of May 1942, flying their first mission, I think June 1st, but just over the patrol of Gulf of Alaska. They weren't near the Aleutians at that time. But they were the perfect fighter for the theater, and they would see service on every single island in the Aleutian chain, and they were in service right up until the end of the war. The models they had there were P-38Es and eventually all the way up to P-38Ls. One of those is still alive at the Elmendorf Air Force Base because it was recovered on Attu. I don't remember what year. Someone will be able to chime in and tell me remind me what year it is. But it was recovered on Attu, and then they brought it back to Elmendorf where they rebuilt it, and it's on display there. So now the other aircraft is P-39s. P-39s arrived, I mean, again, we're having this influx of aircraft, P-38s, P-39s, all arriving around the same time. The P-39 was in service in Alaska for several months. It did many missions. It originally was supposed to go to, I think, Kodiak and Nome and Elmendorf, but once ADAC opened, it went over to ADAC to do missions over Kiska. That was a little bit short-lived also because of the range. So even though we were closer than the original base, the UMNAC Fort Glenn base, ADAC was still, 600 miles round trip away. And we're not talking near engaging in any fighting over the island. So it was stretching the limits of the P-39s. And the P-39s, they had a little bit larger range than the P-40, so they went on more missions originally than the P-40s did. Well, McCorkle, the commanding officer McCorkle decided, well, we're enough in that. We're not going to do that anymore. This is silly. And so they ended up leaving by December of 1942. So they were really only in the theater for a few months. It was up to the P-38s and then to cover the B-24s, which really was the workhorse of the campaign. The B-24 was the workhorse of the campaign. It flew almost on all the missions. Started with an LB-30. Those were on site in May of 1942. But later, not that long after, they would bring up some B-24Ds. And it was the B-24 that would take the spotlight over the B-17s, who were also there. The B-24s ended up flying right through the war. They flew in the Curl Island campaign right up till the end of the war. They could just fly longer distances under load. I know that the B-17 in a lot of theaters takes the highlight, but in the Aleutian theater, which is very unique conditions, it was the 24 that ended up being the workhorse. The 17 ended up being initially, they did low-level strafing missions and bombing missions over Kiska, which is what was needed. Colonel Erickson, who was the bomber command up there, he, out of necessity, invented low-level bombing missions because you had to get under the deck in order to be successful. Initially, they started bombing above the deck. Well, you didn't know where you're hidden. So he would actually get in the airplane and create these maneuvers, which, wasn't very popular with his higher ups for sure, but he was determined on creating something that was successful. So the B-17 was really good at doing that. But in the end, the B-17 and the Aleutians ended up being more like patrol bombing, weather reconnaissance, photo missions, and was out of the Aleutians by most of the squadron. There was a couple that stayed, I believe. Most of them were gone by February of 1943. So it was the B-24 that took the spotlight. I love the B-24, so I'm happy with that. I'm happy to see Lil all the time. So they were performing, the B-24s were performing bombing missions over Kiska, some bombing missions over Attu. Attu was a little more difficult, it was a little longer, it was more shrouded in weather. Some of those things were escorted. They were escorted by the P-38s, but P-40s also got a chance to escort a couple missions in 1942. My grandfather escorted a P-40 bombing mission where they shot down a Japanese plane. One of his Canadian squadron leaders shot down a Japanese plane, and so did Jack Chenault. So they shot down 2 roofs, 2 Zeros on floats during that mission. That was shortly after the runway on Kiska opened up. But that was really short-lived. I think that was the only P-40 escorted bombing mission of 1942 because the range was just too far. It was too far, and there was too many variables, and it was too risky. So P-38s took most of the escort missions up until they built the runway on Chitko. By the end of 1942, the B-26 was a hard aircraft to fly in the Aleutians. We all know it was a hard aircraft to fly anyways. That's why they call it the Widowmaker. But when you're talking about primitive bases and terrible weather on top of that, it wasn't the best suited aircraft for the Aleutians. So they were eventually replaced by B-25s. The B-25, that started around November of 1942, and I think was completed by the end of February 1943, that all the B-26 squadrons converted over to the B-25s. Now, the B-25 was just easier to handle, especially in that environment. It had, some of the models had, firepower at low strafing levels, so it was really ideally suited for the strategy that had been developed in the Aleutians. It may not have had the same range, but by that point we were already advancing airfields west, so the range wasn't as much of a problem. So it turned out to be, the B-25 turned out to be one of the longest standing aircraft in the Aleutians, one of the longest standing bombers in the Aleutians, and served all the way until the end of the war, doing mission over the Kuril Island with the B-24s. Those were the bomber stars of the campaign. Naval air strength. You would think, you just have to think of a theater that has this much water involved, that the Navy has to play a big role. And they did. The PBY, normally known as an observe and attack airplane, more of an observe and attack airplane, not necessarily in the Aleutians. It definitely had its share of offensive work. And it was crucial in the role of defending Dutch Harbor and the surrounding areas. At the time of the attack in Dutch Harbor, it was probably had the large portion of the air strength in that area was the PBY. I mean, just think about it, the PBY. It arrived at the end of 1941, and it was stationed in Sitka, and it was stationed in Kodiak and Dutch Harbor. And it stayed in service through the campaign, all the way into the Kuril Islands, when eventually it was just relegated to patrol duties just in and around Attu. So its role basically was to, detect where enemies were and to then relay that kind of information to the Army Air Force so they could then strategize the appropriate action. And they protected Allied shipping, waters, corridors, and search and rescue. I mean, the PBY alone, for the amount of pilots it rescued out of the waters, is just commendable. I mean, they were an incredible lifesaver to the Army Air Force pilots who ended up having to ditch in the waters or some random remote island. And the PBY, because of its range, the ability to land on the sea and on the land, its slow air speeds at landing, I mean, it was the perfect airplane for the Aleutians. And the radar, not to mention the radar, we'll talk about the radar. So, besides the PBY, they also had Kingfishers and F-4Fs. F-4Fs came up early in that drive to create air strength in Alaska. The F-4Fs, several squadrons of F-4Fs came up. They were very short-lived once they decided that the threat was minimal, that Japan would probably not strike U.S. mainland again. Then the F-4Fs went back to southern theaters, more southern stations, postings. The Kingfisher acted as a observation, very active. The Kingfishers were everywhere in Alaska. Observation plane. They were actually very crucial in the Battle of Attu. They actually replaced F-4Fs because it was a more nimble plane, and the F-4Fs during the Battle of Attu just had the most terrible time. And then PV-1 and PV-2s, Venturas and Harpoons. Now, the Venturas came in January of 1943, and at that time, they were stationed on Adak. Adak had its Army Air Force airfield, Davis Army Airfield, and then it had Mitchell Field, which was about 10 miles away. It was a whole separate airfield, land and sea. So they had a little seaplane base, and then they had a landing base on Adak, and from there they would do bombing missions, the same over Kiska and over Attu. And PV-1s, after we retook Attu in 1943, the PV-1s moved to Casco Field on Attu and then began their offensives over the Kuril Islands and the Japanese installations that were there. The PV-2s came in 1945, a little late to the game, but they were still there, and it was the very first operational PV-2 squadron was stationed in Alaska. So I think those are both very cool pieces of history. Lots of firsts.
Indeed. Were there other naval bases or airstrips that were in the islands, or just the two that you mentioned?
Naval strips in the island would be Casco Field on Attu, which was after we retook Attu, Mitchell Field on Adak. Umnak was an Army airfield. Dutch Harbor that may have been a naval airfield also. Sitka was a naval airfield. That's Southwest Alaska. So there were a few. Most of them were joint.
Right, because at this point in the war, you're mentioning naval air strength. We didn't have a whole lot of aircraft carriers available, especially in the Pacific. So yeah, that would have to have land bases established to be able to operate.
Land base established, and the Bering Sea is not the best place for a carrier. Not the best place for a carrier, there were bays. The PBYs would tender up and be serviced by a tender. So yeah, not the best place for a carrier. So you really didn't see it unless it was the Battle of Attu. They had the Nassau there, which was a carrier, but it didn't do well. They were there a week and they were back south. It just wasn't a good place for a carrier. So the Battle of Attu. So the Battle of Attu was primarily a land invasion. Typically, it would be softened by air support, but in this case, because of the Aleutian weather, it wasn't as, the Air Force didn't play as big as a role as it probably normally would or could. General Butler, who was the commander of the 11th Air Force, he wanted a small escort carrier that was equipped with aircraft to support the ground forces, and that would have been F-4Fs. So they brought a squadron of F-4Fs up. Within a week, they had lost 7 planes, and a few days later, they were going home. The battle wasn't over, but they were going home. The Kingfishers picked up some of that role because it was, again, it had been in the Aleutians a long time. The pilots knew the weather. The aircraft was a little more agile and was able to maneuver better. So the Kingfisher ended up taking some of that role. He also deployed a P-38 squadron and a B-24 squadron and a B-25 squadron and PBYs that would patrol the area around Attu, but those missions, I would say, likely only went off less than half the time. They were successful at getting through. The P-38s had a little bit more luck. That's how bad the weather was. They would go out, they would have to turn around. Sometimes they were there to drop off supplies for ground forces, and they would be dropping them through the overcast, just hoping that it hit something. Well, they might be around here. Let's see if it drops. There was no air offensive on, I don't want to say no, minimal offensive on Attu. They didn't have an airfield. They didn't have a seaplane base. But what the Japanese forces had decided to do was to support the garrison on Attu with air and submarine power. Luckily, our air defenses were strong enough that they weren't able to do that. And there was only one altercation with a group of Bettys that had come over, Betty bombers that had come over from the Kuril Islands. That the group of our squadron of P-38s intercepted them and was able to take down several of their planes. We also lost some P-38s in that same battle, but other than that, there was not much air action going on over Attu during the Battle of Attu. It was a lot of air-to-air combat. I think they lost 5 in that dogfight. They lost 5 Betty bombers. Yeah, and then they never bothered to do that again. They just left the garrison on Attu to fend for themselves. And during the Battle of Attu, they lost all but 27, only 27 Japanese soldiers came out of that battle.
And so, we do have a video clip that you recorded several years ago, talking about the Battle of Attu, but set this up for us. Who are we going to hear from? So you're gonna hear from Bob Brocklehurst. Hopefully some of you have seen Bob before. He's been around. He passed away several years ago, but Bob was the first person to bring the flight of P-40s onto Alexei Point on Attu. He was the one, he was assigned to 343rd at the time, which is a new squadron that developed somewhere within the campaign. And his squadron, he was commanding the squadron. It was sent to bring in the first P-40s to land on Attu. Right after, there were still small pockets of Japanese around the island, so there were small battles going on, but the big battles had already taken place. And again, Benjamin Talley and his troop of Army Corps engineers went on to Alexei Point and created a Marston matting runway for those P-40s to land on. So you're going to hear Bob talk about what his experience was of landing for the very first time 1,400 miles way out in the middle of the Bering Sea, landing on Marston matting just after this big ferocious battle.
I was at UMNAC, and we got orders to basically move the outfit to Shemya, but to take and put in airplanes at Attu, and the ramp would hold only 6 airplanes, just bare steel plank runway, and there was a real short runway at one end was, I don't know, it was maybe 50 feet higher than the water, a bunch of rocks on one end. There was nothing there but that. And the other end was about a 30-foot big pit. I don't remember, but maybe an acre or more, somewhere about 30 feet deep, where they had to dig out the soft muskeg. There wasn't any bottom in there. So the runway was pretty short. And these asked if we could do it. I said, yep, we can do it. 6 guys. So I picked out 8 guys, my best in the squadron, and 2 of them rode the C-47 in, and we flew from 12 airplanes that took from Almanac to Atka for refueling, and then to Adak, this was our staging, and that's where we staged with 6 airplanes and 2 pilots and a C-47 that flew up there, and they didn't want the Kiska people to know we were doing that. Now our army the Japanese had landed on that too, and our army was fighting the Japanese in about 3 isolated locations. I had an overcast where the C-47 climbed up through it. There's a hole on the south side of the mountain at Adak, and I took my 6 airplanes up through that, and we climbed up, got on the C-47, and he started out like on a northwest heading way out, bypassing Amchitka and Kiska by a wide angle so they wouldn't know we're going out there. Well, pretty soon we started, hey, we're not going to have enough gas to go back, and everything's overcast. And man, okay, what the heck? We kept going and stuff, and so I finally turned almost north of that too, and everything's solid overcast. So I figured, well, we had it, but we got there. Here's a big hole in the south side of the mountain, enough for us to get down and land. Just a big, clear, blue sky hole, and we landed. Everybody landed safely. A couple of them had to brake real sharp and come within an airplane's length of the end of the runway, but we did it.
They did it all right. They did it. So some of those planes, although they landed on Alexei Point, some of those planes went over to Shemya, which was operational just within weeks of Alexei Point. And from there, those 2 bases went on to become the bases for land operations and the area in which they launched air and naval attacks on the northern and central Kuril Islands, where the Japanese had military installations. So Japanese air strength, we'll just touch on that a little bit. With the original attack on Dutch Harbor, that was carrier-based aircraft, so that was the Zeros, the Vals, and the Kates. And once they got onto Kiska, they started to develop the seaplane base, and they started to develop a land-based airfield, but that never got developed thanks to the effectiveness of our bombing strategies. And so on Kiska, they had in the harbor, which is really quite a terrible place to have a seaplane base, I might say, they had Mavises, which didn't do well. A lot of those got destroyed because of most of their planes got destroyed because of weather and because of our bombings, our continual bombing whenever the weather would allow. I think we dumped 6,000 tons of bombs on Kiska. And then only for them to evacuate in the middle of the fog in July. But it's just an enormous amount of bombs on this island. So they had Daves, they had Pete's, and they had Jake's. All those were in Kiska Harbor. And the only threat on Attu was Betty's, which we talked about earlier. So that was the air strength of the Japanese at the time. Weather was our biggest enemy. Even to fly, I have met pilots now who fly out to Shemya on different carriers. Shemya is still a base. It's mostly civilian run, but you can't get on it unless you have a reason. You can't even go. I lead World War II history expeditions through the Aleutian Islands, and even on our boat, we have a certain mile radius that we can go around the island. You don't just fly near Shemya. And this pilot now, with all the technology that he has, only gets there half the time. And these guys, we were asking these guys 83 years ago to fly there regularly. You just can't understand what a task that is. Weather comes out of nowhere. Bob used to say, you know, and not just Bob, other pilots, you'd take off. Half the time you don't know if you're going to see the runway when you come back. That was half the thing. The fog can come in instantaneously, and then your runway's gone. There are magnetic anomalies that pull compasses off of their readings. So if that's, especially back then, if that's all you're looking at, you would be miles and miles offshore. And when there's no gas, no flat land anywhere, you're above the deck, you don't know where to descend to. Like these were real challenges that cost lives in the Aleutians. And I don't think that should be understated. They may not have had the big fancy dogfights and combat, but weather killed more pilots than the enemy by like 4 to 1. You might just be going up for a regular routine patrol and you may not come back. That was a real thing, 50% chance you're coming back because of weather. If you're asking these P-38s to go fly 1,200 miles, I think that was the longest journey, 1,234 miles. There and back, there is no other flat land, and there are no runways, no fuel stops, no nothing. That is a long way to go. That is a long way to go. So I think we have Bob talking about the weather. First-hand knowledge here.
What was the most difficult thing about being stationed in the Aleutians?
Fighting the weather really was the most difficult thing. It was very unfriendly, and it was just fortunate in having the older heads to get us accustomed to it. And that was the most difficult thing.
What were some of the things that you would tell the newbie pilots about flying in the Aleutians?
Well, when we first got up there and went half and half into the 11th and the 18th, it saved our lives. Those guys knew the weather, they knew how it acted and things like that. We learned. We learned about the squalls, the fog, the snowstorms, the rainstorms, and they could, that quick, they could come down off of a mountain, and it happened quite a bit. First they had to learn to fly formation. And we would put them on I would take the junior guy on my wing as squadron commander, because that was the best place for him to fly, and other people could watch him. And I put him on the senior guys who were basically lieutenants, who knew the score, and we would tell them how to recognize storms that would be coming, the weather. The lee side of a mountain usually had a hole in it that you could go up through, but never come down through it. It's a lot easier with a mountain slanting, you know, to go up through a hole in the overcast, but to come down was dangerous. You couldn't judge it that well. So we would never come down through a hole. Learn the mountaintops if you're stuck up there, and then let down through the overcast towards the water or something like that. And that was often done by the older people. That's what killed most of the pilots.
Were you ever scared to fly up there?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. People have often asked me if I were ever scared in an airplane. I told them, well, yes, I was scared twice in the same day one time, but the rest of the time I was only frightened.
That's quite a quote.
Bob was an incredible human.
Yeah.
And some of you may have seen it. We did a Warbirds in Review event at Oshkosh one year. I brought him up to Alaska a few times. He flew in a P-51 in, 2016.
Okay.
He was quite an inspiration. So I think I already touched on the Kuril campaign after we retook the islands. And I just will say that the weather in Alaska proved to be the highest combat to operational loss of any theater. I think I said it was about 4 to 1. So it was an enemy. Kuril Island campaign is another unknown kind of last section of the Aleutian campaign, although separate. We the B-24s and the B-25s performed 935 sorties over the Kuril Islands, north and central Kuril Islands, 659 tons of bombs. And the Navy did 692 sorties and 245 tons of bombs. Very active, very little known. And that book on the left is from John Clow. That was one of his last pieces of work. John Clow is the Aleutian Island campaign expert. He was one of my mentors, and he wrote that book shortly before he passed. So it is incredibly thorough and detailed. He was the 11th Air Force historian on base. So anyone wants to know more about that, I would definitely read that. Subsequently, after the war ended and we retook Attu, there were 15,000 people stationed there, way out in the middle of nowhere. Incredible. Now that I go there, I can just see how monumental a task it was to develop bases along the chain in the speed at which they did. So this was a quote from my grandfather, and I discovered this quote after I had already started to do this work, and I couldn't understand why I was so passionate about it. Why was I so passionate about this thing that I had come out of nowhere? And I read this. This was a communication between the Department of Defense historian in Canada, Canadian Department of Defense historian, and my grandfather that he had saved because he was meticulous. He saved the questions and he saved his answers. And it all came very clear after I read that he too felt that this was a forgotten piece of history, and he was glad and appreciative that somebody was doing something about it. And I feel that sentiment through all US or Canadian veterans and the families who say, oh I had no idea my dad did this, or I had no idea my grandfather did this. And I get to bring that to light for them. It's one of the most rewarding things that I do, for sure.
Karen, we appreciate you sharing your stories and some of the history of this somewhat forgotten campaign. And we have lots of questions from our audience. So are you ready? Here they come. Martin writes that his uncle served with the Navy Seabees building air bases in Alaska. Do you have any recommendations or any references on the Navy air operations in Alaska?
There's a great book. I wonder if I have it here. The Alaska had one of the largest contingents of Seabees.
Right.
So I don't have it. I must have been flooded. I lost some of my books in the flood, but it's on a U.S. It's a naval history. It's an official book. I'm not sure if it'll be especially to Seabees or not, but U.S. naval history. There's a great book from Dutch Harbor. But again, on Seabees specifically, there's so many of them. No, that's not it. Anyways, if he emails me, I will give him more specific information. I just can't think of it off the top of my head.
And maybe if you wouldn't mind, if you could just put together a little bit of a reading list, and when we post this, yes, we can put that in the description. So give folks some references. Good.
Yeah.
Are any of the airstrips that were built still open and usable?
ADAC. Okay. You can still go to ADAC and fly a 737 right onto that runway. Dutch Harbor. You can still fly to Dutch Harbor.
Okay.
That's it.
That's it.
I have landed in Umnak on a private plane, so you can do that. LXI, the naval base on Attu was eventually turned into a Coast Guard base, and that closed down in the 90s. So that is still operational. You're not supposed to land on it, but I think it is still operational for certain authorities. Shemya is operational. It is also an emergency base for transcontinental global flights, whatever you call that route, the Great Circle route. So it is, and Cold Bay is another one that's still operational, 10,000-foot runway in the middle of nowhere.
Wow. So quite a few are still there.
A few of them are still there, but most of them are not, yeah.
Okay. Early on in your presentation, you mentioned 144,000, the number of military in the Army Air Corps who were stationed there. Did that include the engineers who also built the bases, or was that just strictly
servicemen? I think it was servicemen.
Okay.
Yep. Probably includes Navy, I would say, in that too.
All right. Oh, here's a good one. Do you fly yourself, or did your research inspire you to explore the possibility?
I have 16 hours and a Champ.
Yes. Awesome. The right way to do it. Tail dragger.
Yeah, 16 hours and a Champ, but that ended, and I haven't picked it up again. Still on my list.
Very good.
But I like to fly in Warbird, so I'll do that anytime I get. I get to fly around Alaska in a 1942 BT-13, so that's pretty cool. And I have retraced my grandfather's flight path several times. A few years ago, I did it in 1942 Widgeon.
Wow, nice.
Yeah.
Here's one from John. He says his wife's uncle was an AMMT in PBY squadrons assigned to the USS Casco and was on board when it was torpedoed in the vicinity of Kisco. He shared some pretty hair-raising stories about PBY patrols in the Aleutians.
I would love to hear
himself. Yeah, John himself served 5 years in the Coast Guard in Kodiak and Juneau. And
cool.
Yeah.
I would love to hear all of, and I would love to hear his dad's stories. And that's how actually what my website started, as me telling the stories of other family members. So again, I encourage anyone who has family members serving to email me so that I can share the story of their service member.
There we go. And there's the website.
Yep, there's my website for sure. So that is a book that I wrote a few years ago with the National Park Service about World War II aircraft in the Aleutian. So this would give you a better and more detailed version of each aircraft that served. There's so many more that we didn't even go over that are in the book. So you can either email me and I can forward your information to the Park Service, or you can email the World War II National Historic Area, and they manage the park up there. They're the ones who protect the World War II historic sites up there. But I would love to hear from you, so email me.
There we go. There's the address one more time. Any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
Thanks for giving me a platform in which I can speak about the campaign and those who served there. And I hope that people feel inspired to learn more about the service of their family members and find out how they contributed to the life we get to live today.
Very good, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us again tonight. And thank you for visiting as well and dropping in on our conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode, or if you have any ideas for any future topics you'd like us to explore. Feel free to drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. Again, if you liked what you saw tonight, please share it across your social media platforms. We appreciate that. And remember, if you are a YouTube subscriber, thank you for subscribing, but also click that bell icon and you'll get notifications when our new episodes of Warbird Tube are posted. And by the way, Karen has a YouTube channel as well, same address as the website. So go check that out and subscribe to her channel as well. We appreciate that. All right, until next time, I'm Steve Bose, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.